Dr. Volkoff, I wanted to start with you. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, across the country, overdose deaths continue to rise dramatically. Last year, they spiked in my home state of Washington by 30%, and much like the rest of the country, were really driven by fentanyl. This is really a national crisis, so we've got to be using every tool that we have to support our communities, including fentanyl strips, which Secretary Becerra mentioned at his hearing here a few weeks ago. The research I've seen indicates that those strips, which are used to detect fentanyl in drugs, are an effective overdose prevention tool, but they require several steps to use them, including chipping off some of the pill to be able to test it. Can you tell us what the research shows about the effectiveness of those test strips, and really, are they easy to use? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. And indeed, the fentanyl test strips have been tested for sensitivity and specificity. And the data shows actually high sensitivity, and there are only a few fentanyl analogs that are not detected. Having said that, the fentanyl test strips were developed for testing drug use in urines of patients that are being monitored. And so now this is a new application, and as a result of that, there can be problems on how it's implemented. Overall, patients that have used the fentanyl test strips report positive outcomes, and actually in terms of identifying drugs that may put them at higher risk. The research is now ongoing to try to determine what are the optimal guidelines on how to use them, number one. But number two, if the results are positive, what is it that the individual should do in case that they still want to consume them? As you know, there are still multiple problems in terms of making these fentanyl tests available throughout the United States, and there is interest on actually determining and getting approval for some of these tests by the Food and Drug Administration so they can be utilized in healthcare settings, which is not possible at this moment.
Well, are there other overdose prevention strategies that you and HHS hope to roll out in the coming months? Talk to me a little bit about what we're doing in terms of prevention.
Prevention strategies that have been shown to be widely effective is perhaps one of the most important ones is widespread distribution of naloxone. And that becomes actually in some instances a challenge if the naloxone is not available for those that use them. Another harm reduction practice that has generated a lot of attention is the extent to which, because the drug supplies is so extremely dangerous these days, in which safe injection sites could be valuable for patients that otherwise may be at very high risk of overdosing. And while the data is still preliminary in the United States, in other countries, they have shown that in certain settings, they can be quite effective. So there is interest on evaluating them. There's also interest in the community to test other products that may serve as harm reduction. For example, the use of kratom, which is sold as tea, and that contains a drug molecule that has effects that are similar to those of buprenorphine, but could be utilized also for decreasing withdrawal depression. So these are more novel, and we don't have sufficient data, but those are things that are being discussed.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Hodes, it is said that science is a marathon, not a sprint. However, Congress has really approached investing in research to treat and cure Alzheimer's disease and related dementias with really a sense of urgency. We have poured resources into this research, $17 billion since 2015, to really supercharge the discovery process with the goal of finding a treatment or cure by 2025. And I'm concerned that NIH isn't positioned to meet that deadline. Given the sheer scale of federal investment, what is NIH doing to deliver meaningful and measurable outcomes that assess its progress towards finding effective treatments?
Thank you for that critical question. And let me answer it very briefly in terms of process, and then with some examples of meaningful accomplishments during this time. As you know, we've counted on critical input from the national and global research communities, advocates, et cetera, with our annual summits, all of which feed into a careful identification of milestones, that is, the goals and targets which are necessary to meet our most important needs. I want to take a moment just to thank the staff of this committee for the interactions we've had over the past year to help us focusing these milestones into meaningful, quantifiable outcomes and making them transparent and available. To touch on just some of the examples of important advances, I would point starting with our clinical trials. So, for example, in pharmacologic trials, there are currently 8 studies targeting amyloid or not, which are phase 3 in their latest stages, capable of identifying definitive positive outcomes, meaningful outcomes clinically, which are due over the next years to reveal their answers. There are some 62 early phase clinical trials at a variety of targets, 3/4 of them not amyloid. These are the results of basic science, which has found more and more potential targets. So the clinical trials or investment in them critically important. You alluded as well to the burden on families and those living with dementia. That is also an area of clinical research, clinical trials. We now are funding a large number of trials studying interventions for care and care providing, which will be producing their results. The National Academies identified 2 of those generated with NIH funds that are ready for dissemination, being disseminated with further evidence. Happy to elaborate as time allows, but these are some of the examples that of accomplishments and of our important process to continue being accountable to ourselves, to you, and to the public for making the best use of these very critical funds to accomplish the highest of priorities.
Well, thank you. And I think transparency is really important. This deadline's right around the corner, and we've put out a lot of money for this, and we need to know as a Congress how those investments are going. So look forward to working with you, and Senator Blunt, look forward to working with you on that as well. Dr. Fauci, you talked a little bit about this, but I wanted to go back through it again. I am really pushing for Congress to pass additional emergency COVID funding to make sure that our communities have the tests and the treatments and vaccines they need to keep their families safe. And I understand that your institute is supporting research on the development of these next generation vaccines that could protect against multiple variants. What can you tell us about the progress of that research, and what does that NIH need to see it to completion?
Well, thank you for that question. Well, the progress has been substantial. To get what we call universal, and that's probably too broad a term, is to get a vaccine that works against multiple variants of SARS-CoV-2 is the first step. And that would be something where you get a vaccine that either is directed against a common component of all of the variants or has each of the components of the variants, for example, in a nanoparticle with a mosaic or multiple components to it. We have studies that are right now gone from preclinical, namely in an animal model, into a human study. And the results actually look very promising. The next step would be to get a vaccine that not only is against all variants of SARS-CoV-2, but against all of those group of variants, including what we call sobecoviruses, which overlap with the viruses that we see in many bats, which almost certainly are the original source of these viruses that have jumped species and gone into humans. The work is going along very, very well. We're getting a number of investigators, both people who've been established in the field and new investigators, but we can't continue it, Madam Chair, without additional resources. And that's really one of the things that is very, very difficult for us because the scientific opportunity is there. And we really feel that we do have this not only as an aspirational goal, but we will be able to get to that goal of getting a vaccine that would protect us against both known and unknown variants. So we're excited about the science of it, but we can't continue without additional resources.
Don't have resources, right? And how is your institute working with Barta to accelerate innovation in the next generation vaccine development, particularly for COVID-19 vaccine?
Well, we've had a long-standing collaboration and cooperation with Barta now for quite a long period of time. And the way that works is that we do the fundamental basic research and proof of concept and very often get involved not only in the preclinical, but in the early trials, whereas Barta partners with the pharmaceutical company to do the advanced development of these concepts. So it's a partnership that has really worked very, very well, and hopefully we'll be able to continue that again with the need for new resources.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Gordon, I want to come back to you. You've had several questions about mental illness. Not surprising, it's a huge issue for America today, and I know that the despite the best efforts of researchers like yourself in the past 30 years, we have seen dramatic increases in mortality, morbidity, and healthcare costs related to mental illness. And that is actually before factoring in the effects of this pandemic and the opioid crisis. And on top of it all, diagnosis is really difficult, and medications don't always work and can have awful side effects. So I know Senator Blunt asked you about using RADx as one possible approach, but what are the greatest barriers to accurate diagnosis?
Well, frankly, one of the greatest barriers to accurate diagnosis, Senator, is that our diagnoses are not terribly good in terms of describing what's actually going on in the brain. And so we need a better individualized approach, not just to diagnosis, but really to being able to make informed clinical decisions in cooperation with our patients. Well, the clinical issue really isn't, does this individual have depression or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, although those diagnoses can be sometimes hard to differentiate in individual patients. The bigger clinical question is, for this patient with depression, are they going to benefit most from a medication, or which type of medication, or are they going to benefit most from a psychotherapy or a brain stimulation treatment? We have a number of different research projects that are aimed at trying to make those kinds of clinical decisions with the aid of technology, with the aid of increased attention to details in the patient's behaviors and cognitions. And that approach, I think, is going to take advantage of things like big data. So we need to collect lots and lots of information about well-characterized patients. And then we need to make careful experiments to try to determine when that information helps us describe that patient better. So it's really about precision medicine and psychiatry, moving it forward in a number of different fronts, from grants to academic organizations, and as I mentioned also before, small business grants that are really paying off. So we should see some progress, hopefully in the future, near future.
So I assume it's fair to assume that solving this diagnosis puzzle would really open doors for better treatments?
It would open doors to transforming how we decide with our patients what treatments to use. It would really change psychiatry. Right now, as a psychiatrist, if I want to help someone with depression, our only discussion is about which side effects they don't want. And so we try to avoid one medication or another, as opposed to which medication or which treatment that I have to offer is going to work better for them. So yeah, it would really transform things.
Dr. Tabak, last week the National Academies issued its review of NIH's autoimmune research portfolio, and the authors found that much of the work that that agency does in this area is really extraordinary, but that NIH doesn't do the best job coordinating or setting priorities or focusing on innovation or evaluating its autoimmune research portfolio. The authors' findings really echo an earlier 2010 National Academy study on women's health research, and to address these problems, they recommend the creation of an Office of Autoimmune Disease Research within the Office of the Director to facilitate collaboration and coordination. Given the importance of this research for communities across the country, it's really critical that NIH does the best possible job facilitating it. Do you have concerns with establishing this office?
Senator, the report, as you know, was released last week, and we're still reviewing the specifics of it. In reviewing the top-line messages, among the things that they suggest that we do, develop an agency-wide strategic plan, make sure that investments that we make align with those strategic plans, coordinate both within and outside the agency, do evaluation, do reports to the Congress. At first glance, I think these are things that we could probably do without the creation of a new office, but I certainly, would be willing to work with you and other members of the committee going forward as we sort through the specifics of the report and get a better understanding of the rationale behind their specific recommendations.
Okay, I'd like to work more with you on that. I think this is extremely important. I want to make sure we're addressing it in the correct way, and I want to talk to you more about that.